Okay, guys, so if you're following along in the notes, this is the section that's titled Winning the War, Day 3. So we're just going to run through a couple points we didn't get to in class this week so you can be all prepped up for the review game and then the test itself. All right, so the main idea in this unit is that the British failed in their efforts to split the colony in two, so they decided that they were ultimately going to drive themselves into the South, gain some support there, and we'll talk about why there tended to be more loyalists there, and then ultimately cause the Americans to give up and to come back under their control. Okay, so the activator that we do in class is talk about why the American Revolution caused so many other countries to strike out and seek their own liberty. You know, it's kind of the beat my chest type thing. But the two biggest examples that we had from last year were Toussaint Louverture and the Haitians. And then, of course, the French Revolution shortly after our own. Okay, so the two individuals that we're going to talk about that are foreigners that influenced the outcome of the war are Frederick von Steuben and then the Marquis de Lafayette from France. So we'll start with von Steuben. His most important contributions are as follows, and this is the 4 bullet points about his contributions. Number 1, he reorganized the units of the American military, the Continental Army, into either by region or sometimes by age. His idea was he wanted to promote camaraderie amongst the men. So he wanted them to be able to fight for each other as well as for themselves. He then created a pyramid training scheme. So if you're familiar with what a pyramid scheme is, basically it's one person at the top who picks up a couple customers below, and they pick up a couple customers. So he used that same principle, but in the idea of training. So whoever's at the top, in this case it was him, he would train 10 to 12 elite officers in the policies he wanted integrated into the army. They would train lower officers. Those lower officers would train lower officers. And then finally, that information could be disseminated to the enlisted men themselves in a more expedient fashion. So he also promoted clean camps, practices which helped stop the spread of disease like we talked about in class. The winter at Valley Forge was almost disastrous because the American soldiers were unsure of how to live in camp for an extended period of time. He also taught the soldiers basic discipline in battle, and in order to be able to follow orders. He is famous for having said something along the lines that he was so impressed by the American military men because he had to explain why they had to do things. In any other military capacity he had been involved in, people just took for faith what he was saying and followed it blindly. He had to work with that and adjust it slightly to make the American experience unique. Couple points. It's not confirmed, but there were serious accusations about von Steuben being a homosexual while involved in the Prussian military apparatus. Therefore, that's probably one of the main things that inspired him to leave Europe and come and fight for the Americans. Maybe a chance for redemption, also just maybe a chance to consider and continue a military lifestyle. But whatever the case was, he proved to be very influential in the outcome of the war. We have a nuclear sub named after him. His training manual in many ways is still similar to the basic ideas that we use for enlisted men today, and women, of course. All right, so the Marquis de Lafayette, his big influence wasn't so much on the battlefield, but in the sense that he was able to really push for the French government to supply troops, ammunition, the support that we logistically needed to defeat the British and their big giant military. So he was a hero here in the United States. He was welcomed as a hero back in France too, and was integral in the early stages of their own revolution. All right, so after Saratoga, like we talked about in class, that was the big turning point where the French decided that they would throw their support behind the Americans. The British do take Savannah. They head to the furthest southern point of the British Empire in North America. They reinstate their own loyalist governor in Georgia. They slowly try to work their way up, gain South Carolina. In many cases, the slaves escaped and joined up with the British. We'll talk about that during the Civil War, too. That tended to happen with the Union Army. The slaves, you can't blame them, were looking for a chance to seek their own freedom. And if they joined up with the British won. It gave them a greater possibility of them themselves becoming free. All right, well, all of this proved to be for naught because, as you can see, the biggest influence the French had on the war was their navy, which gave the American Continental Army a serious fighting chance in the war. Without the French, it's counterfactual, but we would have had a much more difficult time, if not altogether impossible, time defeating the British throughout the course of the war. I like this graphic too. Take a look here at the legend. I'll just let you look at it for a second. You can pause it if you want. Think about why the British would have a better chance of winning the South than they would here in New England. It's much more densely populated, of course, in this period in New England. So there's a greater chance of coming across a rebel or, as we might say, a patriot. But in the South, where things are much more spread out, you don't see as many patriots. In fact, just statistically, there ended up being more loyalists in this region for a couple reasons, but they figured they had a better chance to gain this territory and then work their way back up through the north. That ended up being a failure because of a strategic mistake that this guy, General Cornwallis, made. He set up camp at Yorktown, which we'll take a look at. I'll show you the peninsula here. So he set up camp at Yorktown, which is a peninsula, which was strategically a failure because ultimately allowed the American forces to work with the French Navy, and they basically created a hammer and anvil type situation where the Americans were able to storm the forts. The French military, or the French Navy, was able to bombard them. There was nowhere for the British to really go. In fact, they were blockaded. They were left unconditional in terms of what they had to surrender. So they had to give up basically because of Cornwallis's fatal mistake of setting up camp on the peninsula. All right. So this is cool. I like this. What do you see? What do you notice different about this? Is the siege at Yorktown. If you notice, these are the American soldiers on the left, the British soldiers on the right. Look at the difference between this painting and this one that we saw at the beginning of class. Look at how much more unified, orderly. It just looks like a totally different fighting force. And of course, these are paintings, so they're slightly revisionist, but it's really speaks volumes about how far the Continental Army came throughout the war years. Okay, here's another painting. This is the actual surrender of Lord Cornwallis at Yorktown. And I like this painting. I'm going to show it to you. So these are the negotiators of the Treaty of Paris. So we sent over Adams, Franklin, John Jay, some of our best statesmen. But I love this painting that I'm going to show you right now. And if you notice here, the people on the right, who were all the British delegation, they refused to sit for the painting once they negotiated the peace because they were really so embarrassed about the fact that they had to negotiate with these colonists from the other side of the world. So that's a really cool painting. It just shows how bitter the British were about their defeat. And really, in many cases, some historians argue that though they signed the treaty, they never fully accepted the idea that the Americans were independent. That wouldn't really come until later with the War of 1812. Okay, so the Treaty of Paris did the following. It confirmed U.S. Independence, so to speak. It set the boundaries of where Great Britain still controlled territory in Canada. It largely ignored the rights of Native Americans. They, of course, were not there for the negotiation, and their territory was pretty much divvied up amongst these two groups. The British did promise to repay certain debts, like you'll often see. We studied that with the Treaty of Versailles last year at the end of World War I. And then a lot of people were upset in the colonies, or in now the United States of America, because there was no official date set for the British to actually leave the forts in the United States, and that would become an issue in certain areas. Okay, so the big impact was that American society pushed something called egalitarianism, which is basically the idea that there is a certain amount of equality in all people. And like we've talked about in class, that word equality means something altogether different to us today in 2016 than it did to people in 1783. So many of the loyalists fled the country. They became emigres, like those that you learned about during the French Revolution last year, leaving. Women gained little in terms of legal or political rights. African Americans were, of course, still enslaved. But there was a push, a slight one, in some of the upper southern regions, and of course, northern industrial regions where people started to strongly question the morality of slavery. And then a